Hey guys, I don't have a lot to say in this video, and it's now going to go on for 45 minutes, right? I get positive feedback from people on Patreon, people who've decided to pay $1 a month to support what I'm doing here on YouTube, support my long-term aspirations to be involved in politics of veganism, ecology, animal rights, etc. The long-term aspirations that you've probably heard me express again and again from many different angles on this YouTube channel already. There's not much I can do to express my thanks to the people who, get their credit card out of their wallet and decide to pay me that $1, aside from what I'm going to do here in this video, which is to read out and reply to a couple of those messages. In some ways, what I'm saying in this video is really anticipated by the long conversation I had with American Unicorn. So that's an hour and 40-minute podcast that's already up. It's been up for about a week now. And in it, American Unicorn, she just had decided to delete her YouTube channel. And I talked her through some of the things you need to be prepared for here in the digital vegan demi-monde. I was giving her some encouragement and advice. But I pointed out to her that, some of the shallow and stupid and hateful comments you get may come every 5 minutes. And some of the people who really appreciate what you do in a deep way, they may write to you once a year, or less often than once a year. So these letters are actually good examples of that. Before I read out and say just a few words in reply to these two letters, I'll just say, I think this isn't news, but it's with no false humility that what I do here on YouTube is described as not being activism. This is not activism, or it's not activism yet. I think you can describe what I'm doing here as proto-activism, as setting a foundation for, setting a basis for later political activism. And it's really a beautiful thing that we're able to have these debates, these reflections, these conversations before any of us are committed, financially, politically, or otherwise, to a movement. Now, the bad news is that there is no movement. Currently, the movement doesn't exist. It's a proto-movement. This is proto-activism for a proto-movement. Some of us are more optimistic than others about what we can do as vegans in the future. But, having studied political science, it's a beautiful thing. It's really a wonderful luxury that we're able to debate these things and discuss them in depth and at length, really before any form of activism has begun. By contrast, I'll choose one example. I can think of many examples from history. But in one of my former areas of studies, Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, etc., there were all of these political movements, and often they had political publications. This is before the internet. They had magazines, they had journals, they had, on-paper publications. There were political movements that were loosely defined as anti-war. And they often were coalitions of people that came together with a sense of urgency and crisis. People figured out, oh my God, the United States is dropping so many bombs on Laos. What's really going on? What's this war really all about? And for example, they never really discussed, what does anti-war mean? Does anti-war mean that you support peace at any cost? Does anti-war mean that you care more about peace than you care about human rights or democracy? Does anti-war mean that you would support a dictatorship, a communist dictatorship, or a military dictatorship, or a right-wing dictatorship? Does it mean you would support a dictatorship as long as that dictatorship can deliver peace? There are really hard questions. It's very easy now to look back on those conflicts, and being an anti-war magazine at that time, or an anti-war journal, or an anti-war political movement, are you willing or unwilling to publish, basically what's pro-communist propaganda or anti-American propaganda? Because at that time there was a lot of very serious propaganda and misinformation that might be politically convenient for you as a magazine, might be politically convenient for you to, it's what your readers want to hear. It supports your anti-war cause or movement. But is it true? Is it legitimate? Can it be verified? Can you even know whether or not it's true? And to what extent are you willing to, terrible questions involving terrible ethical compromises. And there was a lot of really terrible scholarship at that time too. There was a lot of really misguided activism and what have you from people whose hearts were in the right place, but very often they never had those conversations, those debates. Maybe they did within their own marriage. I think husbands and wives were torn apart by the Vietnam War. It's a great example of that. Many other momentous political questions in history were like that. On the level of your own family and your own friends, I think people might have sat down and said, well, wait a minute, what does it really mean to be anti-war? What is it we're pro? Are we pro-democracy or what? The fact that you're critical of the war, the fact that you're concerned about the war effort, and those were exactly the words that got used. You'd have the Bulletin of Concerned Asian Studies, you'd have Critical Asian Studies, you'd have these code words in the titles of the publications, and hinting at the fact that these were linked to anti-war political movements. But what does it mean to be concerned about the Vietnam War? What does it mean to be critical of U.S. foreign policy? Obviously, those things don't unite people. There's going to be a great variety of dissident opinions. Anyway, we're at that stage now with veganism, where, as I say, this is sort of proto-activism. This is a prelude to real political engagement, real political activism. But it's a beautiful thing that people are really able to ask these deeper questions and debate them at length. That people are not blindly getting committed to ideologically defined movements. And of course, the exception to those rules, the exception to that rule, the people who are getting blindly committed are exactly the groups that I think I have been criticizing on this channel. I think that in many ways, a guy like Gary Francione or a movement like Direct Action Everywhere, I think they really represent the old-fashioned style of politicking. And what we're able to do now here on YouTube is really new-fashioned. And as with the fundraiser I did before, anyone who disagrees with me on these fundamental issues, they're welcome to disagree. But the point is, different people, different factions are going to take the movement in different directions, and we're going to make different foundations. And that too could be a beautiful thing. The world is definitely big enough for all of us. I can imagine a group of vegans being completely devoted just to ocean issues, just to fishing and ocean pollution. I can imagine another group being totally devoted just to river issues. And again, there will be political differences between those groups, even if they're defined geographically or ecologically or what have you. There are so many categories. Obviously, there could be a group just devoted to zoos, just devoted to circuses, just devoted to high-density agriculture feedlots. So many issues. And ultimately, this is the tragedy of think global, act local. Tragedy is that legally almost all of us are tied to one place, that we have to pursue these global issues on a local scale. We have to deal with City Hall, the local provincial government, the local state, the local governor. Ultimately, we have to cooperate with people who legally are in the same jurisdiction of ourselves, and people who are participating in the same parliamentary system, the same government, wherever in the world you may be living. But anyway, a guy named Tom writes into me. Tom says, "Hey man, what's up? I'm not sure what my true intention of writing to you is, but we'll see where this goes. I've been supporting you on Patreon, and I've been a fan for around 3 months now. It struck me as bizarre that you have had such an influence on my opinion, yet I have never reached out to you, nor to those in your Patreon page." So again, this is what I mentioned in that interview with American Unicorn. People can have meaningful things to say to you. People can be your positive supporters, but they have real jobs, real lives, and they have no particular reason to bother you by sending you, a message every 5 minutes or what have you, the way maybe someone who hates you does. They're not going to badger you. They're not going to waste your time. So after several months, this guy takes time to write into me. Anyway, thanks, Tom. I continue reading. I've been a vegetarian for over 4 years now, and I've transitioned to a vegan diet over the last 10 months. I actually became aware of vegan YouTube by consuming an hour's worth of What I Eat in a Day videos every day. As someone who enjoys cooking, I must admit they really helped me, and I learned a lot. But there's only so much avocado and quinoa a person can watch until you have seen it all. After a few months, I began jumping through the scenes of them talking. So he's talking about skipping ahead in the videos, as I gained nothing from it. I'd heard it all before and became tired. Me watching these videos isn't doing anything productive. Then I found your videos. Your video on community was really what I needed. It's the only video regarding veganism that gave me any passion. God, I hate that word. I don't know why he says that, but anyway, he says he hates the word passion. But anyway, thank you. I can take a compliment. And obviously, I'm glad to hear that video in particular is the one that spoke to you. Apart from when I first began reading up on the subject, I really enjoyed your content on pets, as it had been something I had been debating for a while, but mainly regarding the aspect of pets eating meat. He grew up with pet cats, though I had no one to discuss this with. Isolation is something you've spoken about in your videos. I dropped some of my vegetarian friends due to their involvement with drugs and their inability to be productive in any sense. I just pause. Something, the drug epidemic for my generation, drug use. I can't say it influences all of us, but I think it's been a huge part of so many people's lives. Everybody knows somebody whose life has been ruined or severely impacted by drug use, and that kind of decision we make, who you're going to spend time with. Drugs and alcohol are so often an aspect of it in modern Western culture. So for me also, although as I've said a million times, cocaine is vegan. These are issues outside of veganism, but obviously they overlap with and intersect with veganism, and they're really the decisions. They can be of decisive importance if you're putting together a crew of people to actually go to City Hall, to actually get organized and do anything related to veganism, ecology, and animal rights. Who is and who isn't a drug user may be the decisive issue. This has freed me to a large extent. So he was saying cutting off these old friends has freed him to a large extent. And I have a strong group of politically minded friends. But I'm finding more and more how isolating my diet, lifestyle, and philosophy makes me. My studies are in engineering, an area obsessed with efficiency and building a better tomorrow. But, nevertheless, veganism is a rare thing. I've been stuck in an echo chamber for several years with engineers and scientists believing they're brighter than humanities students. However, most of the people in my sector lack any political discourse. Conversations aren't practical. Many speak about our problems being solved through technology, and it's common to hear, well, we'll have nuclear fusion soon, so there's no point in building wind farms. Or, we'll all just be given pills in the future, so I can keep eating meat right now, because in the future it'll be fine. He then admits, okay, these examples have been edited to sound even more stupid than they really are, but that's honestly how I hear it sometimes from his colleagues. Many people in this sector would rather have fun and entertaining conversations about 50 years into our future rather than next year and the years following. Change doesn't happen as the result of technology. Political decisions give technology its application. So I just pause. I think as we all mature and we grow older, it's with no pride that I say that political science and politics is so important in life. In a sense, it's a luxury. It's a wonderful thing if you live in a place in the world where you don't have to constantly worry about politics, where politics isn't, constantly interfering with and superseding your other concerns and interests in life. But I think part of, maturity in almost every field, unless you work in a field that doesn't involve other human beings, in almost every field, as we mature, we start to realize that politics is alloyed with, mixed up with, is an inextricable part of just so much of human aspiration and endeavor, whether it's in the arts or in the sciences or what have you. But obviously the process of realizing that and then what the implications are of your personal life is very different from one person to the next. But yeah, real social change, he is saying, doesn't just happen as the result of technology, because political decisions supersede that. Political decisions give technology its direction, its focus, its application, as he says. I continue this letter from Tom. I do have the name right. Yeah, I'm just using first names here. Tom. I come from Wales, studied in England, and currently live in a small town in Hessen, Germany, working for an engineering firm. This isn't cool Berlin. It's Wurst, Schwein, and potatoes. Thank God for potatoes, he says. Birmingham, England, while not the most glorious of cities, was a student city where my veganism wasn't anything shocking. The move to Germany has proved to be difficult. I write as I have admired your ability to remain vegan in some of the more difficult areas, and has certainly given me the strength to not let this struggle get me down. It's possible to feel isolated even when surrounded by friends, and I worry that my sector and current living arrangements are clashing with my beliefs. Don't get me wrong, though. I absolutely love my work, and living in this country has hugely benefited my language skills. Thank you for making veganism political for me. I have always been very interested in European politics, and I have really enjoyed what you have had to say from your background in political science, a term that many in my sector would regard as an oxymoron. Thank you for opening my eyes to areas such as Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand. In the past, I would have never been interested in the people and systems surrounding these countries, and I may have been so Eurocentric as to believe that I could only gain something cultural by visiting within Europe. Although Europe is somewhere that will always have my heart, he says. Keep your videos and podcasts coming, man. Keep keeping it real. Hit me up, Tom. So thanks very much, Tom. I don't have a lot to say here. I mean, this video is mostly just made in appreciation for my supporters. How do hospitals operate? The answer is in part scientific, but it is really in large part political. Yes, obviously science is inextricably intertwined with every aspect of what happens in a hospital, good, bad, and indifferent. But the organization of the hospital, what the hospital does, how it works, who is and who isn't a doctor there, who's in charge, who gives orders and who follows orders, who gets to be a patient there and who doesn't, how they pay, who's excluded and who's included. So many of the crucial questions of the hospital, including just how it's organized, how effective the hospital is, how effectively it's using the resources it's given, its budget, its millions of dollars. So many of those questions are political that even though it may be invisible to us at first, especially if you come out of a pure scientific background or a pure medical science background, as we mature, we have to learn to look at the world and see the politics that's bound up in everything, to see the inextricable, ineluctable sense in which these institutions are political, and in which the changes we can make to them, especially in the short term, next 10 years, next 30 years, those changes are really political in nature. I don't say that with any pride in the discipline of political science. Academically, political science is largely a disaster, especially in Canada. I could do a whole separate video on how pathetic political science is in Canada. It really is worse than it is in the United States. It really is. And I'm sure it's very different, for example, in Germany. Be interesting to talk to someone there and contrast my analysis of what happens in Canada, what happens in Germany. So, these things, it's definitely very different in France. I looked into that. Sciences Po in France. Whole different story. But in any case, it's not out of any pride in the academic discipline. I have no pride whatsoever in that academic discipline. But it's out of this deep awareness I have that when we look at the world around us, when we look at these institutions, the questions of organization, the questions of potential change, those are really political questions, even though the sciences are involved in every stage of it also. Just one more example. How does a nature reserve operate? A nature reserve, a national park, forest conservation area, whatever term you want to use. The answer, the really meaningful, important answer, is really political. Yes, there's science involved. There's science involved in counting the numbers of animals and figuring out which animals are endangered and keeping track of how many wolves there are and how many deer. But the fundamental question, for example, of whether the budget for it, whether or not it exists, how the lines are drawn on the map, and then what is the purpose of this institution? Does a national park exist in order to sell as many tickets as possible to a ski lodge, or does it really exist to benefit endangered species, habitat conservation, or other goals? May exist for public education reasons also. Do you take kids from the inner city and take them out to the countryside and show them what a bear looks like in the wild, or a moose, or anything else? There may be all sorts of reasons, social reasons as well as scientific reasons, as well as animal rights type reasons for why that institution exists. But the differences we deal with are not really so much in science. They're in political science. And that may be tragic. Maybe the world would be a better place if those questions were not political, but they are. Okay. Next letter I'm going to read is from Molly. Thank you, Molly. Thank you for joining my Patreon. Thank you for paying the $1 a month. Hello, Eisel, Molly writes. It is my pleasure to finally reach out to you. I've been a subscriber to your YouTube channel for over a year now, and I've been meaning to message you at some point. So again, just like I said in that interview, hour and 40-minute interview with American Unicorn, a lot of the people who appreciate your work most They don't pester you every day or even every month. They write to you after more than a year, which is great. Thanks for writing in, Molly. And I think you'll soon hear she has a pretty busy life. She's doing a lot of meaningful things in her life. She has a lot of meaningful aspirations. She has a lot of better things to be doing than writing into me. I come to you now seeking advice and discussion because I already know so much about you. I will include a bit of background information about myself. I'm a 21-year-old public health undergrad student in Florida. So university degree is in public health. So coincidentally, that's quite like the example I just used of a hospital being really an intensely political institution and organization, and questions of hospital reform really being more political than scientific, or political scientific. I became vegan 2 years ago when I learned about the daily atrocities committed against animals and decided I could no longer take part in it. I changed my diet overnight and spent the rest of that week ridding my house of all products of cruelty I could find. After watching just one of your videos on vegan philosophy, I felt I had finally understood who I am. I can take a compliment, thank you, Molly, but that is quite a compliment. She says after watching just one of my videos on vegan philosophy, she felt she finally understood who she is. Well, thank you. I do not make my videos for a huge audience. It's wonderful now that so many of my videos reach about 2,000 viewers, but it's the depth of what's being shared here that I think is really important. Sometimes I put up videos that are just for fun, that are just silly. You guys know that. But obviously, this is the stuff that's going to matter 5 years from now. 5 years from now is not that far in the future. It's really not. But 5 years from now, Molly will be 26, not 21. I don't even want to think about how old I'm going to be. But I'm really not worried about this week's controversy. I'm worried about building that future for myself, for her, for all of us. And yes, ultimately for the animals, for ecology, for the planet. But we got to start with getting 5 people or 50 people organized who can really make a difference in this world. Most of my life, she says, I considered myself a nice person who just had a more humanitarian heart than most others I met. But I have been slowly casting off the nice girl facade I was operating under. I am bitter. I am impatient. I want change. It's the realest thing in the world. I mean, look, it's good that you know that at age 21. It's good that you're aware of that. And, you may go through a period of time when you're a bit out of control in that. I don't know you. I may have it completely under control. But the fact that you know it and you can write those words at age 21, I think means that, as soon, maybe by age 23, you may really be 100%, you may have perfected that really difficult art of being passionate, highly motivated, and, ambitious. That's what you're talking about. You got to take that bitterness, that impatience, that desire for change, and harness it. Or harness is not a very vegan word to use. Shape it into a kind of ambition that's productive in your own life, and that hopefully makes you more friends than it makes you enemies in terms of how you share that passion with your fellow man. But nobody's perfect, and you don't need to be perfect, and you don't need to live a lie. And you don't need to live under a facade. You don't. You don't need to pretend to be a nice girl. And, niceness is suitable for some things and not others. That's all it comes down to. This brings me to why I have contacted you, Eisel. I will be completing my undergraduate degree this coming spring, and I'm looking forward to the future. I do not desire to become another cog in the corporate machine. I want to bring about real change. Legislation against animal cruelty is the most impactful solution, correct? So this video is not going to be a long discussion. I mean, I think she's hoping to start a long discussion, which is great. I'm happy to talk about this stuff. Legislation against animal cruelty may really not be the best goal for you to be pursuing, short-term or long-term. This stuff, guys like... I'm not going to quote authors. There's no point. I was going to quote some figures from history of political science. But there are questions of, legislating against the majority. Matters of principle come first when we're in face-to-face conversation with our fellow human being, but matters of principle come last when you're talking about legislation. We're not going to have a despised minority of less than 1% of the population foist a resolution that, for example, makes all factory farming illegal in a democracy at a time when the vast majority of people support factory farming. Now, I don't even have a statistic for that. Currently, there are no polls on how popular or unpopular, factory farming is. And as I mentioned recently in the video that was talking about how weak the comparison to slavery is, before you even got to the Civil War in the United States, the debates around slavery had totally dominated, U.S. Congress, U.S. Senate for such a long time. This is a major, defining issue that had reorganized politics in the United States. And veganism isn't. I mean, most people are not even aware of it, and I'm certain the vast majority of the population, if you ask them about factory farming, would kind of reluctantly look at you and say, "What? What are you talking about?" and would simply report that they don't care. Now, that was not the case at all with slavery before the Civil War. It wasn't the case with slavery after the Civil War, even less so. Everyone was mobilized. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone regarded it as tremendously important. So, legislation against animal cruelty, short term, well, sure, if you can do it, if it's something that motivates people, to some extent in politics, the process is the product. I was talking to another vegan who has a YouTube channel about lobbying, and I was really saying to her, look, the strength of lobbying is that you can deliver something meaningful to your donors right away. The process is the product. So if me and this other YouTuber, if we go to City Hall or provincial parliament in Canada, to some local level of government, we prepare a little speech, a deposition that's presented to the government, and we film that and we put it on YouTube, then we get to turn to our donors and say, look, these are your donations at work. Here's what we did with the money. We put together this information, we went to government, we lobbied government. And if absolutely nothing else comes out of it, if everybody in the provincial parliament sits there and says, I don't care, I just want to eat bacon sandwiches for lunch, if that's the attitude of people in government, still the process is the product. And for your social movement, for your foundation, for your donors, ultimately, there is something meaningful you're doing. So I'm really stating this as a sort of concession. However, at this stage, in 2016, I think the most fundamental struggle is exactly what I talk about in my video on community that's already been mentioned before. It's the struggle to go from being an invisible minority to being a visible minority, from being a despised minority to a highly vocal, highly respected minority. And as I've said so many times, I think the really positive example in Canada for my generation is the gay rights movement, is that gays went from invisible to visible, from despised to respected. Really, that's not understating it. They went from being despised to being respected. And then ultimately, at the end of that process, they did have legislation that gave them rights they didn't have before, that legislated new civil rights, really. But that was the end of the process. It really was. It was the final step. And that was at a stage when, the opposition to those legal reforms had really become dug into a very narrow defensive religious posture, where they had less and less of a constituency behind them, and so on. For something so specifically, she's saying legislation against animal cruelty. It's a very, very distant goal. Now, what about legislation against polluting rivers? See, that's a wedge. It's a different wedge. People who eat meat, if you frame it in that way, you say, look, you eat meat, so you support factory farming. But factory farming can change. I'm a vegan. I don't support factory farming, but here's one of the problems with factory farming is that they're polluting the rivers. So I want this legislation that protects your drinking water, that holds this industry to a higher standard. This is just one, I could go on all day. I gave the example ages ago of even the standards for the trucks that leave the factory farms. You can pick things that are so minute they're meaningless, but obviously river pollution is not meaningless. So choosing the type of legislation and then how you can build a constituency, how you can build the core of the movement being devoted vegans, but choosing a topic where the door is going to be open at Parliament, the door is going to be open with the public, with the press, because you haven't chosen something as narrow as animal cruelty. Because obviously the whole of factory farming would end. If animal cruelty is really illegal, then overnight factory farming has to cease to exist. So, if we're looking at this step by step, those issues, for example, water quality, that may be, I don't know where she lived, Florida, somewhere in Florida, it may be that you've got to pick a very different, a very different legal issue, at least to begin with. But as I say, to some extent, the process is the product. There is actually some value in presenting to Parliament or to a local city hall. There is actually a point for you and for your movement, for your followers, just in making the presentation, just in doing the lobbying itself. Even if you, but on the other hand, in terms of building that visible community, there's also a point in opening restaurants, nightclubs, having dance parties, whatever. I mean, there are all these things that, again, they may seem trivial in isolation, but for gay rights, they really built communities, real communities. And for veganism also, now we have to be building real communities. Why doesn't San Francisco have a vegan district? Why doesn't London, England have a vegan district? It should, Many of the great cities in the world, now and in the future, need to have a vegan neighborhood. The same way they have a gay district, or the same way they may have a Chinatown, a Chinese district, or what have you. And again, the most fundamental message that delivers is, we're here, we're not going to disappear, we're a part of this society. And that long-term, slow undertow of the moral demands we're making, the ecological concerns we're presenting, that's given a body, that's given substance. That's something that gradually and inevitably the whole world will have to take seriously, no matter how inconvenient it is, no matter how unwanted a challenge it is to their traditions, to their daily dietary habits, to their religious beliefs. Because it's easy to forget, veganism, it's a challenge to every Thanksgiving dinner. It's a challenge to all of the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. All of them are built on, ultimately, a tradition that began with animal sacrifice and with meat eating being a major ritualized part of that tradition. So you got to choose your issues carefully. Obviously, for example, I do not think a strong issue to choose is, the criticism of halal meat, which in some place, I'm told in Australia, some of the ecological groups chose that, where they made that the wedge issue, was that the standards for making halal meat or kosher meat are worse than the standards for other kinds of meat. From my perspective, water pollution, instead, much more dynamic first step to choose. And we are talking about a first step for someone who doesn't already have a foundation or a movement that we're part of. Anyway, so I continue. Molly's email to me. Molly says, I'm considering going to law school, but only to become an animal rights defense lawyer. However, I would prefer any other route besides surrendering another 3 to 4 years for intensive study and countless hours working just to pay it off. Law is not of interest to me as far as academic studies goes, but I feel a calling to make huge changes for the animals. So, pause, I'll continue in just a second. A lot of people in Canada wanted to go into human rights law for this reason, and the fundamental advice you have to give to those people is, no, there's no such thing as a human rights lawyer. You first have to just become a lawyer, then you have to become a respected lawyer, and then you become a respected human rights lawyer. You may be underestimating just how many years of sacrifice this path involves in terms of working in areas of law that don't interest you in any way, and what kind of work is involved in the long, slow path of just earning a living as a lawyer, let alone being, respected. That process, based on what you already told me, I think you're already aware this is not the path for you. But being known as a good lawyer, being known as or even a great lawyer, having that great reputation, having that foundation, and then slowly building up, because I take it you're not born a multimillionaire, building up the capacity to have your own law firm, and then to have that law firm have a reputation for ecology, animal rights, etc. It's a long, slow, difficult path. But look, if you go back, I have one video, a couple hours long, talking to a lawyer who's involved with ecology, specifically in Washington, D.C. There are some people who manage to do it. There's some people who manage to do meaningful work that way. And if you can get in touch with any of those people, including Stephen Fate himself, they may give you a much more positive view of that field. They may say to you, no, you can get meaningful work, and here's how to do it. And it's not as bad and as bleak as what this political science guy makes it out to be. But obviously, becoming a lawyer is something I had to consider for myself at several very different junctures in my life. I'd say it is still not completely impossible. Probability is approaching zero that I would ever become a lawyer, though. Molly's letter continues, I guess what I'm asking of you, assuming you have knowledge of American law, is to help me find another avenue to impact the current laws without suffering through law school. Well, we may continue this discussion for years. Life is long. On YouTube or by email or what have you. I'm skipping over a few paragraphs here in the letter. Molly continues, I want to see real change in my lifetime. I want to see the factory farming industry collapse in the next few decades. We only have so much time. Yeah, it's real. I've only positive things to say about it. You know this about yourself. You know that this is your ambition, and you know how you feel about it. At age 21, you've got a lot of the pieces of the puzzle. It's true, there are a lot more pieces to put together, but it's very positive, basically, that you've reached this level of self-awareness. I opened this video with a comparison to the anti-war movement, opposition to the Vietnam War in the United States. So I'm going to close with the same comparison. The reality is, the anti-war movement was a failure, and it was a failure in many different ways, both short-term and long-term. And I really sincerely believe that this failure began with, crucially, a failure to define what anti-war itself meant. In the context of a political emergency, in the context of so much emotion, in the context of feeling a sense of shock and horror when you're looking at photographs of dead bodies, and you're being told this is being done by your army, by your taxpayers' dollars, etc., etc., it's very easy to overlook those fundamental philosophical and political problems. It's very easy to just say, well, we're the good people because we're anti-war, and whoever disagrees with us is bad because they're pro-war, and to run roughshod over all those questions. Now, of course, it was a failure just in the sense that it totally failed to end the Vietnam War. The actual reasons for why that war ended when it did had everything to do with a man named Nixon and another man named Mao Zedong in China, and a unique political arrangement, so-called strategic triangle in Cold War politics. The Vietnam War ended when it did for reasons that had absolutely nothing to do with protests in the streets. It had nothing to do with letter-writing campaigns or any other form of political activism within the United States. That may be sad, that may be a bitter pill to swallow, that may contradict a sort of fabled narrative we have that glorifies street protests in our culture, but it's the truth. It was a failure in the short term, but it was even more of a failure in the long term. Because that deeper question of what does it mean to be anti-war, what does it mean to be pro-peace in the context of the politics of that time, or in the context of our politics today? Do you support peace at any cost, peace at what cost, etc.? Well, as soon as the Vietnam War was over, or was officially and ostensibly over, the government of Vietnam was a human rights disaster, and it still is. It still is a source of shame and consternation. It's not quite as infamous as North Korea, but still, people who felt they were protesting on the side of peace and human rights and maybe even democracy soon found that they were making excuses for yet another communist dictatorship, and that in fact some of the people on the pro-war side who had issued really grave warnings about who the communist side were, what they would do, and how they would repeat many of the same things that the Soviet Union had done in the history of communism. Many of the same problems would happen again. A lot of those people were proven correct. They proved to be right. Which again is a very difficult pill to swallow. It's in history, most of the time there are no good guys. But, definitely people who put decades of their lives in that movement were then left feeling that after all, the bad guys had won. Had they done the right thing? Look at the real outcomes. As terrible and brutal as the U.S. intervention in Vietnam was, the U.S. withdrawal, which again was part of a collaboration with communists, it was part of a strategic partnership between the United States and Communist China, this raised even more difficult questions. And those difficult questions, of course, for the very small number of people who really paid attention, who really cared, those questions had to be asked again and again, because in some places the Vietnam War never ended. Most obviously Cambodia. The war just kept going on as part of that strategic partnership between the U.S. and China. And that is truly a story for another day. I think a lot of people, before they started watching videos on my channel, felt completely confident that they knew what veganism meant. And plenty of people felt offended and felt angry at me that I was questioning the meaning of veganism, that I was raising really difficult questions, whether about vivisection, scientific research, pet ownership, insects, about killing mosquitoes, about the fact that raising crops such as wheat and fruit, all of our vegan foods, that those also kill insects, the morality of killing insects. I think they felt genuinely hurt and offended and shocked that I was asking questions that ultimately point to the heart of this movement and its pretensions and its ethical aspirations, and really ask again and again, what is veganism? What should veganism be? What do we want veganism to be? What is the future of veganism going to be? And that's simultaneously just as absurd as asking, what does it mean to be anti-war? And yet it's also just as meaningful. It's just as crucial. It's just as integral to our success, both short-term and long-term. Probably the easiest way short-term to organize a vegan political movement is, like the anti-war movement, is to just have a negative definition. There were quite a few movements that have come and gone. Some of the most extreme movements were just anti-vivisection. And everyone involved felt that they understood what being anti-vivisection meant. It's very simple. It's simpler than being vegan or being pro-ecology or pro-environment. And those movements tended to fall apart whether they had success or failure, or a mixture of both success and failure. What happens to the anti-war movement once the war you're protesting against is really over? For me, even though now in veganism we're so far away from having any meaningful victory you can name, I'm still haunted by that question. So again, I can point to an example you've heard me indicate many times. Mothers Against Drunk Driving. I think they did win many of their victories. They became this very powerful and influential organization, but they didn't disappear. Mothers Against Drunk Driving is still going every day to primary schools and high schools and is educating children and teenagers about drunk driving. Their mission never ended. Their political mandate never ended, even after they scored quite a few victories. They didn't fall apart. And I think that reflects that they have a core membership. They have a group of people supporting them who really understand that mandate, who really understand the costs involved, and who really built a political foundation long term. It's one of the greatest success stories within Western democracy of a civil society organization. And, they've changed the world in a way that's meaningful to them. That's the challenge we're all looking at, both in terms of the process and the product. We want to pursue this change that's meaningful to us. But it does start with, and again, we have this luxury. It's a beautiful thing. We're in this wonderful position before we've even started. It does start with these questions of really, what is the meaning of veganism? And the reality is, in 2016, 2 different people will have 2 very different answers to that question. And 10 different people may have 10 different answers to that question. And I'm trying to find the people, whether there's 5 people or 50 people, who have come to the same conclusions that I've come to, and who have a high level of confidence, reliability, competence too, high level of intellectual self-discipline, high level of rigor, and who are willing, in the next 10 years, next 20 years, next 30 years, to fight through democratic means, through public forums, through public education, through real political activism, who are willing to fight to make that change. And the beautiful thing is, if you disagree with me, if your vision of veganism and your vision of the future is different from mine, great. You start your own YouTube channel. You start your own foundation. And, maybe there can be real mutual respect. Maybe there can be real mutual admiration between us, despite those fundamental differences. because even if it's in very different ways, we will both be working to make the world a better place.